All right, good morning. Welcome to Coffee and History. This is going to be Rhodesia Part 3, Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe, and the Failure of Democracy. So in our last video, we left off the Rhodesians being tired of a continuous state of war and suffocating UN sanctions, finally decides, all right, we're going to open up the polls to everyone. They do this, the first elections are held, and Smith's government is voted back in by a landslide. The United Nations sees this. The United Nations, working with the British government, who used to, of course, run Rhodesia, sees this as a failure. They send in thugs, agitators, force Rhodesia to immediately have a second election, or they're going to re-implement their sanctions. The ballot boxes are stuffed and influenced because now people have time to prepare for this, namely the Chinese government, and a guerrilla fighter by the name of Robert Mugabe is elected. Imagine that, the British and the United Nations being the bad guys again. So, the day that the United Nations forced democracy in Rhodesia was the day democracy died in Rhodesia. When Robert Mugabe took power, he granted himself almost immediately dictatorial powers and essentially made himself president for life. In fact, his government was in place until just last year, 2017. He was finally ousted by his own people, by his military, in a sort of a soft coup. So Mugabe, being a guerrilla, basically a terrorist who was trained in China, he turned around, of course, put in place the Marxist ideology that he was trained on. And in the same respect, he turned around and exported all of the country's wealth after nationalizing it to China. So essentially, Rhodesia became a sphere of influence for China. Again, we're looking at that third wave imperialism I was talking about, where a country puts in place a sort of a tin pot dictator. The United Nations had done this a couple times. In this case, China won out in this one. So essentially, Rhodesia is now a colony of China. There is generations and generations of famine in the country. Law and order pretty much broke down. Anyone who was sympathetic to the original Rhodesian government, which of course was the majority of the country, was targeted. The black and white Rhodesian soldiers, a lot of them were murdered in reprisal killings. And even so far as, if you recall in my first video when I talked about the Mugabe and the Shona, they even started warring with each other again on a small scale. So the country completely fell apart. In 1980, Mugabe renamed the country Zimbabwe, and I'm sure you've heard of that. The UN even went so far as to try to put some of these sanctions in place against Mugabe because he was such a brutal dictator after they had actually installed him in power. And of course, now that brings us to Zimbabwe today. It is one of the poorest countries in Africa. The life expectancy there is something like, your 20s or your 30s. They've recently just now ousted Mugabe, and they're trying to they're kind of trying to bring back some of their agriculture. They're trying to do some stuff to save their currency, but it's really just not. The damage is gone too far at this point. And even despite all the aid and things that China brings into this country, it's just getting thrown into a hole at this point. There's just no really turning back from this. And so what we take away from this is you've got to sit there and separate yourself from sort of these easy, quick, knee-jerk emotional reactions. You know, you look at the Rhodesia, Zimbabwe situation and you say, you know, oh, that's horrible that they didn't let everybody vote. But then when you turn around and look at what happened when they did, and the fact that they never even had a chance. Once they opened up the elections, their government got back in. And the United Nations didn't even give that a chance. They turned around, threatened them, made them open the polls again. I mean, the entirety of the world was against this country, and it was for really no reason other than everybody wanted their uranium. There was no noble cause here. So an entire nation of people was snuffed out over mineral resources, which is the constant theme in Africa. It's just in this case that happened to be a country that was controlled majority by whites. So it's a very sad story, and I could go into a lot of first-hand accounts from Rhodesian veterans and things like that. That would be a whole nother video. And it's something you could spend your lifetime studying, your lifetime learning about. And really, the lesson here is leave Africa the fuck alone. And it would be okay on its own. If the Chinese and the United Nations had butted out of Africa and not decided to make it a microcosm of the Cold War, Sub-Saharan Africa right now would be probably one of the most prosperous areas in the world. It has more diamonds, more uranium, tin, gold, oil. I've heard stories where you go to places in Africa and you just sort of sift through the sand and you find diamonds there. So why is this the poorest region on the planet? I mean, United Nations. And then the other takeaway is, how many generations have to go by before we're not trying to pin crimes on people? And what I mean by that is, the Dutch settlers came to this area in the 1600s, and then in the 60s, a war was fought with the given reason of these people took our land. And I just don't buy into that. I'm sorry. Imagine if somebody walked up to you and said, hey, your 5 times great-grandfather stole my car, so now I'm going to come and steal your car and I'm going to kill your family. And the rest of the world comes up behind him and it goes, yeah, see, you deserve it, you piece of shit. That's not logical. That's not sane. You have to remove your feelings from this shit and look at it through, just facts. And ask people who were there what happened. Go up to a black tribal resident of Zimbabwe today and ask him what government he would rather live under. And I guarantee you he would say Smith's Rhodesia. I know this for a fact because I've gone out and done this. So, and of course, don't take exactly what I've said to heart, because if you remember my revisionism video, it's almost impossible for anything to not pass through a political lens. And obviously I have sympathies because I've talked to a lot of these veterans and things like that. Read into this yourself. Ask these people and find out for yourself. So this is going to wrap up the Rhodesia series. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.